Hey everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to a time long before empires had PR teams. Before the Romans, before the Greeks could really agree on whether Mycenae was a myth or a place, and before the word collapse started trending in academic circles. There was the late Bronze Age, and then quietly, inconveniently, it all sort of fell apart. So dim your lights, wrap yourself in whatever fabric brings you peace, and settle in, because tonight we're wandering softly through one of the most mysterious, slow-burning catastrophes in ancient history. A moment where entire civilizations seemed to vanish, almost like they forgot to exist. And at the core of it, we find a curious phrase, carved into stone with ancient indignation: the Sea Peoples. Because of course, if your empire's getting ruined, it helps to blame someone faceless and suspiciously nautical. Let's drift back to around 1200 BCE. The Eastern Mediterranean in the late Bronze Age was a fairly decent place to be. You were royal, of course. You had powerful city-states, fabulously named kingdoms, and all the usual upper-class perks. Palace complexes with rooms dedicated to ceremonial bread storage, gold-leafed furniture that no one sat in, and tight-knit dynasties. Both politically and genetically, there was Egypt, tired but still functioning. The Hittite Empire, huge and slightly confused. Mycenaean Greece, aggressive and fond of shouting. Ugarit, coastal and increasingly nervous. And Cyprus doing its best to stay neutral and profitable now. These civilizations weren't just minding their own business. They were part of an intricate web, trading, marrying, invading, and occasionally sending passive-aggressive letters to each other. We have records of kings sending gold jewelry to other kings' wives, of princesses being shipped off as diplomatic gifts, often with whole carts of perfume and God's knows what else. They had international diplomacy, multilingual scribes, complex treaties that included clauses like, "Please don't raid us again this summer. It's been a hard harvest." In short, things were going reasonably well, and then they weren't. Between roughly 1200 and 1150 BCE, everything began to unravel. Palaces were burned, cities were abandoned, trade collapsed. Some kingdoms vanished so thoroughly that we only rediscovered them in the 19th century during awkward archaeological digs and the occasional accidental trench. And what caused all this? Well, according to some very panicked stone inscriptions, there were peoples from the sea. Let's take a closer look. Now, we get most of our information from the Egyptians, because they were the only ones left with the energy to write things down afterwards, and even they were not thrilled. Meet Ramesses III, a pharaoh who on paper was still impressive. He built things, he issued grain, he looked stern in profile. But mostly, Ramesses III spent his reign trying very hard not to be the pharaoh who lost everything. Around 1175 BCE, he left us a very dramatic inscription on the walls of his temple at Medinet Habu. It describes how strange foreign peoples who apparently had never heard of proper etiquette arrived in waves. They came by land and sea. They brought their ox carts, their entire families, and what historians like to call cultural baggage, but what probably included far too many goats. They attacked Egypt, and according to Ramesses, he effortlessly defeated them. Naturally, he even included illustrations, lots of spears, curiously feathered helmets, and, of course, enemies shown in that traditional Egyptian style, kneeling in defeat and wearing expressions of mild inconvenience. But who were these people, really? That is the mystery we don't actually know. The Egyptians didn't name them individually, at least, not in ways we can clearly connect. They just listed vaguely threatening tribal names: Shurdan, Shekelesh, Luka, Peliset, and others, which, to be fair, sound less like invading armies and more like boutique dog breeds. But wherever they came from manned, scholars have debated everything. From the Aegean to the Balkans to the back of a dream journal, they seem to have shown up just as everything was falling apart. Coincidence? Maybe, but also, probably not. Let's drift sideways now, to see who was collapsing and how impressively they managed to do it. We'll begin with the Hittites. Now, if you're not immediately familiar with the Hittites, don't worry. They ruled a vast empire from central Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. They had legal codes, chariots, and kings who had strong opinions about barley. Their capital, Hattusa, was enormous. Stone walls, ceremonial gates, storage for thousands of clay tablets, and a general feeling that someone was always plotting. Something by around 1200 BCE, though, things were unraveling. Famine, rebellions, the usual administrative panic. And then the records just stop. Cities burn. Hattusa is abandoned. There are no final words from the last Hittite king. No grand farewell, just a sudden archaeological silence. It's as if the entire bureaucracy misplaced itself, forever. Next up, the Mycenaeans. The Greeks before they were properly Greek. The Mycenaean world was built on palatial arrogance and a deep love of linear script, which we call linear beer system, designed, it seems, to make lists. Endless lists. Grain, weapons, wine, slaves, goats. There's something soothing about how administrative their records are. You can feel the ancient middle management energy. But all was not well in the land of overbuilt palaces. Sometime around 1200 BCE, the Mycenaean centers, Mycenae Pylos, Thebes, start going up in flames. Archaeologists find destruction layers, signs of siege, and once again, no explanatory note from management. No king stood up and declared, "We've made a series of unfortunate decisions." They just vanished. Within a generation, Greece slid into a kind of dark age. No writing, no palaces, just smaller villages, simpler pottery, and, one assumes, a lot of awkward silence. And then there's Ugarit, a coastal city-state in what is now Syria. We actually have letters from Ugarit, fascinating little tablets sent in sheer panic. One of them reads roughly, "The enemy ships are here. Our cities are burning. Where are the reinforcements?" And then radio silence. Literally, the site shows signs of sudden destruction. Burned storage rooms and tablets left mid-sentence, like someone was interrupted while documenting just how inconvenient everything had become. So what was going on? Was it just the sea peoples? Not quite. Let's drift into some of the more nuanced disasters. You see, when entire civilizations start collapsing, it's rarely due to just one cause. It's not usually a dramatic Viking-style invasion with themed helmets and background music. It's more like an uncoordinated mess of bad luck, bad weather, and bad leadership in the late Bronze Age. They had all three. First, climate change. Yes, even then. Evidence suggests a prolonged drought hit the region, shrinking crops, emptying granaries, and sending hungry people looking for someone to blame. Second, earthquakes. The Eastern Mediterranean sits on a tectonic buffet of fault lines, and archaeological layers show destruction consistent with seismic activity, not swords. So, while some cities burned from invasion, others may have just fallen over. Third, internal rebellion. A lot of these palace systems were top-heavy. You had kings, priests, and scribes. And then you had everyone else, mostly farming, mostly tired, and not always loyal. When things got bad, the people at the bottom may have decided they'd had enough of writing inventory tablets for someone else's gold couch. And finally, economic collapse. These kingdoms depended on trade. Tin for bronze, grain for labor, diplomatic marriages for mutual flattery. Once trade routes began to fail, whether from raiders, famine, or general incompetence, the whole system broke down. No tin, no bronze. No bronze, no weapons, no weapons, no palace. You can see how this might become a problem. So who were the sea peoples then? Migrants, perhaps fleeing their own collapsing homes. Mercenaries, raiders, refugees, possibly all of the above, wrapped into one inconvenient, feather-helmeted package. They may have simply been the last domino, the cause, but the final push in a very long, tragic row. And so they were remembered, not as individuals, not as nations, but as a vague, collective nightmare, a storm from the sea, a scapegoat for a world that no longer worked. Let's drift forward now, gently, into the strange aftermath of drift forward now, gently, into the strange aftermath of collapse. Because the fall of a civilization is not like a curtain dropping at the end of a play. There is no applause, no tidy exit, just the lingering scent of burned archives, the awkward shuffle of displaced nobility, and farmers trying to decide whether they should keep tilling the fields or start looting what's left of the palace. After the sea peoples, and the earthquakes, and the famines, and the assorted bureaucratic crisis, what remained wasn't so much a post-civilization era as it was a very confusing transitional period. Some places held on, some didn't notice what was happening. Others collapsed so completely that their entire cultural memory became archaeological guesswork. Egypt, for instance, technically survived, which is generous. After Ramesses III supposedly fought off the sea peoples, he spent the rest of his reign issuing rations and trying to look regal while the economy disintegrated. Grain prices soared. Tombs were robbed sometimes by the same workers who had built them. Entire regions stopped paying attention to whoever was in charge. In fact, Ramesses III's own death may not have been natural. There's some evidency, deep cut to the throat, as revealed in CT scans, that he may have been assassinated. Probably as part of a palace conspiracy. Because nothing says we're still a stable kingdom like the pharaoh getting murdered during a staff meeting. But Egypt limped on, with less territory, less gold, fewer statues, but enough scribes to say, yes, we're still here. Other places weren't so lucky. The Hittite Empire was so thoroughly erased that even neighboring civilizations seemed unsure where it had gone. Their language disappeared. Their archives vanished. No Hittite novels, no lamentations, not even a dramatic farewell poem. Just charred ruins, scattered tablets, and the sound of modern archaeologists sighing into the dust. In Greece, the Mycenaean palaces never came back. Instead, the region entered what scholars call a dark age, not because it was all evil and brooding, but simply because no one wrote anything down for several centuries, which, for a civilization that had previously recorded every goat transaction in triplicate, was a bit of a change. It was during this period that even literacy faded. The art of linear B was lost. People still made pottery, but it got less fancy. Settlements got smaller. Some were built inland, away from the sea, as if someone had developed a lifelong fear of boat-shaped problems, and Ugarit, that charming coastal city that once sent letters to Egypt asking for help. It was never rebuilt, not really. Its destruction was total enough that it remained a ghost town for centuries. A former capital turned into a very quiet archaeological dig site, patiently waiting for modern scholars to find its last unfinished letters. So what does it mean when an entire age collapses? It's tempting to imagine something sudden, dramatic, trumpets of doom, feather-helmeted pirates sweeping across the land like something from an overpriced Netflix series. But in reality, it was probably a slow-motion unraveling. Some places fell overnight. Others clung to life for decades, gradually becoming shadows of their former selves. Trade routes shrank, temples crumbled, the sacred tablets stopped arriving, and eventually, people stopped expecting them to. Let's pause here and look more closely at one of the things that made this collapse so peculiar: the loss of writing. Because when you go to sleep in a literate society and wake up in an illiterate one, it tends to cause problems. The Bronze Age collapse wasn't just about fire and famine. It was about forgetting. Entire scripts went out of use. Records vanished. The scribes, those meticulous men who had once catalogued every jar, every cow, every minor celestial alignment, were now unemployed. Or worse, Linear B disappeared in Greece. The Hittite hieroglyphic script faded with the empire. Even in Egypt, scribal schools declined in quality and quantity. With no international diplomacy, there was no longer a need to translate 6 languages just to mail a treaty. And when people stopped writing, they stopped remembering in the same way. What was lost wasn't just language, it was memory. Let's drift for a moment into the libraries that once were. Ugarit had archives. Not one room, but entire wings filled with tablets, trade agreements, religious hymns, marriage contracts between kings who likely hadn't met their wives yet. And these weren't random scripts. The scribes of Ugarit wrote in multiple scripts cuneiform, Akkadian, and their own local alphabet, one of the earliest known. Their correspondence shows diplomacy, economic planning, and a healthy appetite for threatening neighbors with vague promises of retaliation. Then came fire. Clay tablets, unlike papyrus, can survive burning, but not if they're crushed by falling walls or left in abandoned rubble for 3,000 years. When archaeologists uncovered the remains of they found the archive mid-sentence, literally, letters on desks, seals still warm from the last use, panic in baked mud. It's haunting in a quiet way. Like finding someone's to-do list from the day civilization ended. But in other places, the loss was even more complete. In Greece, without palace centers, there was no longer a system for training scribes. The ability to read and write vanished outside of a few religious enclaves. People returned to oral tradition stories passed down by voice, often reshaped with every telling. That's probably how we got Homer, not as a contemporary of the Mycenaean kings, but as someone living centuries later, singing faint echoes of a world long gone. It's not surprising, then, that the Iliad feels like a nostalgic fever dream. Bronze-clad heroes, vast armies, ships with 1,000 sails. It reads like someone trying very hard to remember a time before everything got smaller. Because that's what the post-collapse world was, smaller. Let's wander now into what came next. After the dust settled, the Eastern Mediterranean entered a long, quiet period of rebuilding. It wasn't glamorous. No golden thrones, no international alliances sealed with perfume. just villagers, farming, local chiefs who tried their best not to be murdered. In Greece, the Dark Age lasted roughly 400 years. During this time, people gradually relearned how to write, but this time they borrowed a script from the Phoenicians. The Greeks adapted it, added vowels, and eventually produced what would become the Greek alphabet. A small innovation, really, but it changed everything, because with that alphabet came poetry, law codes, and philosophy. Once again, people began recording their thoughts, not just lists of grain and oxen, but ideas. In other parts of the Near East, new kingdoms slowly rose. The Neo-Hittites, a term that implies they were trying to rebrand established smaller cities in former Hittite lands. The Assyrians, who had been rather quiet during the worst of the collapse, began expanding with a great deal of enthusiasm and brutality. And of course, the Phoenicians thrived. Coastal traders, they slipped into the economic vacuum left by the fallen empires. They sailed west, set up colonies, and politely avoided getting involved in other people's catastrophes by 800 BCE. The world looked different, older, perhaps, less centralized. But new things were stirring. Iron replaced bronze, a small technological shift, but symbolically massive. Bronze required tin, which had to be imported. Iron, though harder to work, could be sourced more locally. This meant more weapons, and more people who could afford them. Palace monopolies faded. Power shifted toward warlords and tribal leaders. Warfare became less elegant, more frequent, which, naturally, led to new styles of leadership, some of which involved yelling very confidently on hillsides. The age of the chariot was over. The age of the hoplite was beginning. But what happened to the sea peoples? Let's drift gently back. To them, those mysterious invaders who may or may not have caused the collapse. Some scholars believe they settled in new lands. The Peleset, for example, are often associated with the Philistines. Yes, those Philistines who show up in the Hebrew Bible as inconvenient neighbors to the Israelites. Archaeology suggests they were newcomers to the region, with Aegean-style pottery and a fondness for pork, which did not help with local interfaith relations. Others may have integrated into existing societies, hired as mercenaries, married into tribes, or quietly vanished into the background like so many people displaced by war. Because ultimately, history doesn't always give us a satisfying conclusion. The Sea Peoples weren't a single group. They didn't leave memoirs. No Sea People scribe wrote a noble justification titled Why We Did That Thing to Ugarit. And so, we are left with fragments. Egyptian walls, burned cities, mysterious names, that echo faintly through time. But maybe that's the point. The Bronze Age collapse wasn't one event. It was a slow, complicated, inconvenient unraveling of everything that had once seemed permanent. And the Sea People's real or just the face we put on that unraveling, the name we give to the silence that followed. Let's float there for a moment. In that silence, a world without palaces, without scribes, without letters traveling by ship to distant kings, just small villages, dust settling on old roads, and stories passed by firelight trying to part to tonight. We're drifting softly into the warm, rum-soaked winds of the Caribbean. It's the late 1600s and early 1700s, which means Europe is once again exporting violence, bureaucracy, and very questionable trade practices to every coastline it can find. But out there somewhere between the Spanish Main and a gently burning British outpost, there's another group setting sail, ragged, salty, and occasionally democratic in the most chaotic sense of the word. The pirates, buccaneers, sea robbers, sometimes heroes, sometimes nuisances, often both at once. So fluff your pillow, dim the lights, and let's float into the gently rotting decks of the golden age of piracy. Because for about 80 years, give or take, the Caribbean was less like a colonial paradise and more like an unpaid internship for violence, and naturally, into this power vacuum stepped the pirates. Not the charming, eyeliner-wearing types from modern films, but real people. Angry, sunburned, and often missing several useful limbs. Let's begin, quietly, off the coast of Jamaica. It's the mid-1600s. England has recently taken Jamaica from Spain, because colonial powers in this era essentially played risk with real boats. The island is hot, overgrown, and full of promise for sugar plantations, slavery, and tax revenue. The English crown, being extremely invested in profit and extremely uninterested in nuance, sets up the colonial town of Port Royal. Now, Port Royal deserves a moment of your drifting attention. It quickly becomes one of the most notorious cities in the entire New World, a place where drunkenness is expected, debauchery is routine, and pirates, strangely enough, welcome. You see, England didn't yet have a strong navy in the region, so instead of sending fleets, they legalized piracy, sort of. They issued something called letters of marque, essentially permission slips, that said, as long as you're only attacking Spain, go nuts. And thus, the buccaneers were born. The term comes from boucan, a method of smoking meat adopted from the native peoples of the Caribbean. The original buccaneers were hunters living on remote islands, smoking wild boar, and slowly realizing that raiding ships might be more profitable than drying ham. They were soon joined by disaffected sailors, indentured servants who would run off and board European criminals with a taste for salt and violence. Together, they formed loose bands of sea raiders, hopping between islands and political allegiances with all the loyalty of a cat in a fish market. Their targets, primarily Spanish ships. Spain, of course, had been merrily extracting gold and silver from the Americas for over a century, sending treasure fleets home with absurd amounts of wealth, and the buccaneers were not thrilled about being left out. One of the earliest and most legendary of these freelance horrors was Henry Morgan. Yes, that Henry Morgan, the one now immortalized on rum bottles, forever smirking like he just stole your ship and your girlfriend. Let's linger on Morgan for a while. Henry Morgan was Welsh, which explains a lot, depending on your views of Wales. He arrived in the Caribbean in the 1650s and quickly made a name for himself as someone who could both lead a raid and survive drinking contests in Port Royal. He was charismatic, competent, and almost aggressively opportunistic. Morgan didn't just attack ships. He went after entire cities in 1668. He gathered a crew of over 400 pirates and launched an overland assault on the city of Portobello in modern-day Panama. The Spanish defenders, somewhat reasonably, assumed no one would be insane enough to attack. Through the dense jungle, Morgan was, and naturally, it worked. He captured the city, looted its churches, and reportedly used monks and nuns as human shields, though, to be fair, the accuracy of this claim is debatable and almost certainly exaggerated by people who wanted to make him sound worse or better, depending on who was telling the story. A few years later, Morgan upped the stakes. He led over 2,000 men on an expedition to Panama City again, overland through snakes, heat, and what can only be described as unforgiving and somehow They won. Morgan and his men looted the city, burned much of it to the ground, and then staggered back to the coast, richer and definitely more mosquito-bitten now. This is where things get quietly absurd. England and Spain had recently signed a peace treaty, so technically Morgan's attack was illegal. He was arrested and brought back to London, and then he was knighted. Because of course he was. Sir Henry Morgan returned to Jamaica not as a prisoner, but as lieutenant governor. He spent the rest of his life suppressing piracy, which is a bit like hiring a fox to manage your henhouse. He died wealthy, respected, and absolutely riddled with health issues from years of drinking, disease, and what we'll kindly call excessive buccaneering. His grave, ironically, was swallowed by the sea in an earthquake that sank part of Port Royal in 1692, a fittingly dramatic end to a life that seemed allergic to quiet. Let's drift onward now, into the late 1600s and early 1700s, the peak of the Golden Age. Piracy, by this point, had evolved. No longer just English freelancers with royal permission. It now included former privateers turned outlaws, ex-naval officers, and disgruntled sailors who'd been paid in promises and rope burns. And with peace spreading across Europe, however, shakily many of these seafaring men found themselves out of a job. A pirate's life offered something few other professions did: equal shares, a vote, revenge against the upper classes. And rum-dot ships during this era were often semi-democratic in the loosest, most rum-fueled sense. Captains were elected. Booty was divided by share. There were even early versions of workers' compensation. Lose a leg, gain a tidy payout. The pirate code, immortalized in fiction, was real. Not universal, not always followed, but often surprisingly fair. In some crews, punishments were voted on. In others, disputes were settled by dueling on a sandbar, which wasn't especially fair, but at least gave you a view. Among the more fascinating aspects of pirate culture was their rejection of traditional authority. Many pirates had once served under brutal naval officers, men who flogged and starved them, who paid them in mouldy biscuits and national pride. As pirates, they were free, or so they told themselves. Free to loot, free to vote, and free to spend their earnings on women, alcohol, and questionable fashion choices. Let's meet a few of the more colorful figures from this period. Quietly, calmly, with mild bewilderment, Edward Teach, better known as Blackbeard, not actually the most successful pirate, but certainly the most theatrical. Blackbeard wasn't just a man, he was a performance. He tied slow-burning fuses into his beard before battle. His goal wasn't just to win, but to terrify. His flagship, the Queen Anne's Revenge, was a former slave ship that he upgraded and armed to the teeth. He blockaded the port of Charleston, South Carolina, for days just to get a crate of medicine. Then he vanished. Blackbeard understood that reputation was power. If merchants were too scared to resist, he didn't have to fight. And if officials thought he was insane, they were less likely to negotiate. Eventually, he accepted a royal pardon, temporarily, then went back to piracy. Naturally, he was killed in 1718, in a dramatic battle off the coast of North Carolina. It reportedly took 5 gunshots and over 20 sword wounds to bring him down, which is either evidence of his legendary toughness or an extreme overreaction. His head was cut off and hung from the bowsprit of the ship that killed him. A final performance, whether he liked it or not. Then there's Charles Vane, who refused royal pardons and insisted on being a pirate to the bitter end. He was eventually captured and hanged, still unrepentant, still angry, or Calico Jack, Rackham, stylishly dressed failure of a pirate, better remembered for his two crew members, Anne Bonny and Mary Read, both of whom disguised themselves as men and fought fiercely. When they were finally captured, the men begged for mercy. Bonny and Read, they declared they were pregnant, which, at the time, was a perfectly legal way to delay execution. It worked for a while. Mary Read died in prison. Anne Bonny disappears from the records. Some say she returned to England. Others say she lived out her life quietly in the colonies. Either way, she remains a favorite among those who like their pirates bold, mysterious, and only partially documented. Let's gently ease into the twilight of piracy. By the 1720s, the colonial powers had had enough. England, Spain, France, they were all tired of losing gold and faced to seaborne anarchists. The Royal Navy began cracking down. Pirate havens like Nassau in the Bahamas were retaken, cleaned up, and rebranded. Public executions increased. Heads were displayed along docks. Pardons were offered but rescinded if you sneezed in the wrong direction. The golden age of piracy, like all golden ages, ended not with a bang but with bureaucracy. But the legends remained as we settle more comfortably into this rum-soaked world. It's worth reflecting on what made the golden age of piracy tick, not just the flashy battles and treasures, but the quietly weird day-to-day existence of those who chose to live outside the law, and the sometimes baffling contradictions at the heart of pirate culture. You might imagine pirates as wild, ruthless bandits with little care beyond pillage and plunder. And yes, some were exactly that. But many pirates lived by surprisingly complex codes of conduct and had social structures that, if you squinted, looked almost democratic. In a time when most people were born into rigid class systems and faced brutal punishments for the smallest disobedience, pirates offered a kind of rough equality. Not perfect equality, certainly not if you were unlucky or new, but enough to attract men and women who'd been crushed by the more traditional systems of the day. For instance, pirate crews often elected their captains. This wasn't a case of handing power to the guy with the loudest voice or the most intimidating tattoos. Instead, captains were chosen for their leadership skills, experience, and ability to keep a fractious group of cutthroats from tearing each other apart during long sea voyages. If a captain failed or became unpopular, the crew often did vote him out. A literal pirate coup. Not quite a voting booth, but closer to democracy than most 18th century governments would ever get. Moreover, shares of treasure were usually divided fairly. The captain might get 2 or 3 shares, quartermasters a bit less, but the ordinary crew members each received an agreed-upon portion. Injuries were compensated too. Lose a leg or an eye, and you'd be paid extra to make up for your handicap. This level of workers' compensation was almost unheard of in the rigid, hierarchical societies the pirates came from, and yet, despite these enlightened-sounding rules, life aboard a pirate ship was harsh. Discipline could be brutal. Sailors were often rough men prone to violence, quick tempers, and bouts of terrifying drunkenness. Disputes over treasure, women, or insulted honor sometimes ended in bloodshed. And the lawlessness that pirates embraced outside the ship did not mean the absence of rules inside it. On the contrary, the ship itself was a tightly regulated microcosm, where order was essential to survival. The ocean was unforgiving, and a mutiny could leave everyone dead or stranded. Let's pause for a moment to drift over to some lesser known, but no less fascinating figures of this era. The ones who add flavor to the story like a dash of cayenne in a pot of slow-cooked stew. Stede Bonnet, known affectionately or perhaps mockingly as the gentleman pirate, was quite the anomaly. Born to wealth and privilege in Barbados, Bonnet somehow decided that the comfortable life of a plantation owner just wasn't quite reckless enough. So, in his early 30s, he bought a ship with his own money, hired a crew, and became a pirate. Captain, yes, he literally bought a pirate ship. Like ordering a custom car, but with CANNONB Bonnet had no prior sailing experience, no idea how to command a crew, and absolutely no natural affinity for the brutal business of piracy. As you might expect, his efforts went poorly. He struggled to keep discipline, was frequently outmaneuvered by rivals, and generally came off as the sort of man who should really stick to fox hunting. What makes Bonnet so endearing and perfect for a sleepy history is that he teamed up with none other than Blackbeard for a while. It's as if the chaotic, theatrical Blackbeard took pity on the bumbling gentleman and tried to teach him the ropes. The relationship didn't last long, but it adds a touch of tragicomic flavor to the era. Eventually, Bonnet was captured and executed in 1718. His story remains a curious footnote. The only pirate captain who was truly an accidental pirate, and arguably the most polite one to ever sail the Caribbean. Moving on to Anne, Bonny, and Mary Read, two of the most famous women pirates who somehow managed to convince everyone they were men for years. Both were fierce fighters, and their stories are peppered with moments of quiet defiance and bravado. Anne Bonny, daughter of a wealthy plantation owner, ran away from home as a teenager and ended up in the Caribbean, where she met Calico Jack. Rackham, a pirate captain with more flair than skill. Disguised as men, Anne and Mary fought alongside their crews, often with surprising ferocity. The two women were finally captured in 1720. Their trials included the convenient plea of pregnancy, a legal tactic that delayed executions. Mary Read died in prison, but Anne Bonny's fate is less clear. Some accounts suggest she was released and lived quietly. Others, that she disappeared into legend. Their presence challenges the traditional image of pirates and shows how the sea offered some a strange kind of freedom from the gender norms and social constraints of the day. Not that it was an easy life, just a different kind of difficult. Let's gently glide now toward the economics of piracy, which are often overlooked in favor of tales of sword fights and buried treasure. Because, as with many things, money made the world turn, even in the lawless world of buccaneers. Piracy was, in many ways, an extension of colonial economic rivalries. The treasure fleets of Spain, laden with gold, silver, and goods stolen or extracted from the Americas, were the main target, but pirates also preyed on merchant vessels of all nations, disrupting trade and undermining the fragile colonial economies. Interestingly, some pirates operated almost like rogue business people, setting prices on ransom or selling captured goods. Through secret networks, black markets flourished. Islands like Nassau in the Bahamas became pirate republics, hubs of commerce where stolen goods were bought and sold openly. But piracy was a precarious business. Ships were expensive to maintain. Battles were risky, and the law was unforgiving. Many pirates returned to legitimate life when they could, seeking pardons offered by colonial governments anxious to suppress the disorder. As the 1720s dawned, the age of piracy began to fade, largely because the colonial powers finally decided to put some serious muscle into chasing down pirates. The Royal Navy expanded its presence, in the Caribbean, hunting down pirate ships and taking back strongholds. Pirates who were captured were often summarily executed, their heads displayed on spikes as warnings. Pardons were offered to those who surrendered peacefully, but few trusted these promises, and the pirates who accepted pardons often found life. On land, just as harsh and unforgiving as the ocean, if not more so. The decline wasn't sudden, but it was relentless. The romanticized freedom pirates enjoyed was replaced with the hard reality of colonial order and law. So what do we take from the golden age of piracy? A few gently unsettling thoughts as you drift closer to sleep. Pirates were products of the time, shaped by economic desperation, colonial conflict, and social inequality. They created their own rough justice, their own fleeting communities on the open sea. They were violent, yes, but also surprisingly organized and, in some ways, progressive. Their legends live on, but beneath the myth lies a complex web of rebellion, survival, and human frailty. And somewhere out there, the ghost of the Queen Anne's Revenge still sails the warm Caribbean breeze, carrying the dreams and nightmares of those who chose the pirate's life dangerous, wild, and briefly free. Part 3. Imagine once more those narrow, twisting alleys and cramped houses, the air heavy with smoke from fires burning day and night to purify the streets, or so they hoped. The fear was omnipresent, a quiet fog that seeped into every corner of life. Even the most hardened city dwellers felt a shiver when the distant bell tolled, signaling yet another death. It was a time when sickness and death were both common and mysterious, an ever-present part of existence. Plague doctors often kept journals, though not the kind of diaries you might imagine, filled with private thoughts or dreams. Instead, their notes were clinical and brief, listing symptoms, dates, and outcomes. These records, however sparse, provide us with a window into their daily grinder litany of pain, hope, and inevitable failure. They wrote of swollen lymph nodes turning black and oozing, fevers that refused to break, and the sad inevitability of seeing families wiped out one by one. Their tools, modest as they were, included sharp knives to lance buboes, herbal concoctions, brewed in small pots, and cloths soaked in vinegar to clean wounds. They sometimes used fumigations of sulfur or burning juniper under the belief that smoke could cleanse the air. The medical community of the time was fragmented and often at odds with barber surgeons, apothecaries, and physicians, each claiming their methods were superior. The plague doctor often occupied an uneasy middle ground, respected by some, scorned by others. What made the plague doctor's role so peculiar was the blend of public health and public spectacle. Their appearance was unsettling enough to scare away the faint-hearted, but it also served a practical purpose, warning the healthy to keep their distance. The very sight of a plague doctor meant that death was nearby, yet for many, it also meant that help had arrived, however limited that help might be. Their presence was both a symbol of dread and a slender thread of hope. The plague also altered the rhythms of daily life in ways we might find strange today. Markets closed, schools shuttered, and social gatherings were banned. People fled cities en masse, abandoning homes and livelihoods, though for many there was nowhere to run. Quarantine measures ranged from the sensible to the absurd. Houses were sealed with boards nailed across doors, sometimes with the occupants still inside. Guards patrolled to prevent escape, turning neighborhoods into ghost towns. One fascinating, if grim, custom was the use of plague crosses. These were painted large red crosses on doors to signify a house where infection was present. Beneath the cross, words like "Lord have mercy" were inscribed, a desperate plea for divine intervention. For the neighbors, these marks were both warnings and curses, symbols of danger that also reminded everyone of the fragile boundary between health and illness. Families were often torn apart by the plague's relentless spread. Children lost parents, parents lost children, and many ended up wandering alone, or worse, taken in by strangers who could barely care for them. Orphans became a common, tragic sight. Some were cared for by the church or charitable organizations, but many were left to fend for themselves in a hostile world. It's hard to imagine the quiet suffering behind those empty eyes and thin frames. Plague doctors themselves were not immune to fear or despair. Many accounts speak of their exhaustion, of the way they carried the weight of death on their shoulders, day after day. Some became ill and died, their protective gear offering little real defense. Others grew resigned or desensitized, performing their grim tasks with mechanical precision. The psychological toll must have been immense, though few wrote about it in detail. Instead, their records focus on symptoms, deaths, and treatments, clinical notes stripped of emotion. In some cities, the role of the plague doctor was highly formalized. They were appointed by municipal authorities, given fixed salaries, and required to wear the distinctive costume to make identification easy. Others worked freelance or on a voluntary basis, moving from town to town. Conditions varied widely. In Venice, for example, a city with extensive maritime trade, the plague doctor was part of a larger system of quarantine and public health measures that, while primitive by modern standards, showed early attempts at disease control. The plague's impact on the nobility was no less profound. While many fled their estates to escape the contagion, others contracted the disease and died. Some royal families lost multiple members in quick succession, plunging courts into chaos. The fragility of dynastic lines was painfully exposed, as heirs were wiped out and thrones left vulnerable. Political instability often followed, with rival factions vying for power amid the confusion. Even kings and queens were not spared. The bizarre remedies and superstitions of the age. There are accounts of monarchs bathing in hot springs or rubbing themselves with animal fats, convinced that such measures could repel the plague. Some sought the counsel of astrologers or mystics, desperate for guidance in a world gone mad. These attempts, while earnest, rarely helped, but they illustrate the profound uncertainty and fear gripping every level of society. It is perhaps in the stories of individuals that the plague years' peculiar humanity shines brightest. Take the case of a young apprentice in Florence who kept a secret journal detailing his fear of infection, his love for a girl who had vanished, and his hope that the city might someday return to normal. Or the tale of an old woman in Paris, accused of witchcraft because she tended the sick with herbs and potions no one understood. These small stories offer glimpses of life behind the statistics, reminding us that history is not just dates and numbers, but people living, suffering, and sometimes enduring. As the centuries passed, knowledge slowly grew. The discovery of the plague's bacterial cause and its transmission by fleas on rats revolutionized medical understanding. Though this came long after the worst outbreaks, the plague doctor's costume, once practical, became an anachronism, part curiosity, part haunting reminder. Public health measures improved, and cities grew cleaner, though the plague itself never entirely disappeared from the world. Reflecting on this era invites a quiet meditation on human vulnerability and resilience. The plague doctors symbolize both our best and worst instincts, the desire to help, the fear of the unknown, and the limits of what one person can do in the face of overwhelming tragedy. Their story is not one of triumph, but of persistence, a slow, weary resistance against an invisible enemy. So, tonight, as you lie in bed and the world outside fades, imagine the soft tap of wooden shoes on cobblestones, the faint rustle of a heavy leather coat, and the muted whisper of a doctor's breath through a strange, beaked mask. It is a ghost from the past, a reminder that even in the darkest times, there are those who step forward, uncertain but determined, to face whatever comes next. As we continue to drift along these quiet, shadowed paths of history, it is worth lingering a little longer on the daily realities of those who lived in the plague's long, oppressive shadow. The year might be 1348 in Florence or 1665 in London, but the world feels unchanging in its strange mixture of hope and hopelessness. The streets are silent, except for the distant tolling of bells, the occasional cough from a shuttered window, and the soft, weary footsteps of the plague doctor making his rounds. Imagine, if you will, the weight of that long leather coat, stiff and heavy, pressing down as he moves slowly past empty doorways and barricaded homes. The plague doctor's role was part mimetic, part social worker, and part grim messenger. In an era before vaccines, antibiotics, or germ theory, he represented one of the few organized responses to a calamity that seemed as uncontrollable as the wind. His was a lonely job. He often worked without much support, visiting homes where the sick lay in isolation, where the air was thick with the smell of death and the sound of weeping. His wooden cane was a practical tool, but also a simpler way to maintain distance, to poke without touching, to signal that the invisible enemy lurked too close. While we tend to think of plague doctors as solitary figures, they were often part of a broader system of public health, rudimentary though it was. Towns and cities established plague commissions, groups charged with enforcing quarantines, supervising burials, and trying to prevent the disease from spreading. It was an early form of government intervention in health crises, a kind of proto-public health that, despite its flaws, laid important groundwork for modern epidemiology. These commissions had the unenviable task of balancing fear, superstition, and the harsh realities of death. Orders might include the closure of public spaces, the burning of contaminated belongings, and restrictions on movement. Households with infection were often sealed inside, doors nailed shut to prevent escape or contact with neighbors. Sometimes, the entire block or quarter was cordoned off, guarded by soldiers or militia who kept watch to enforce the quarantine. It was a cruel and isolating punishment, but one believed necessary to save the wider population inside those sealed homes. Life became a slow, painful test of endurance. Families cared for the sick as best they could, often without adequate food, water, or medicine. The plague struck indiscriminately, yet it often hit the poor hardest, who lived in overcrowded, unsanitary conditions. The wealthy might flee to country estates or walled gardens, but even luxury could not guarantee safety. The rich and poor alike experienced the same helplessness as loved ones withered away. It's worth considering the psychological toll of this era. Fear was not just a reaction to the disease. It was a constant companion, coloring every thought and decision. Communities fractured under the strain, trust eroded, and suspicion flourished. Neighbors looked warily at each other, unsure who might be infected. Accusations flew. Some blamed foreigners or minority groups, fueling outbreaks of violence and persecution. Others turned to religion for answers, while a few retreated into nihilism or despair. In this crucible of fear, the plague doctor became a paradoxical figure. Both dreaded and needed, he inspired a mixture of hope, suspicion, and dread. His eerie costume made him instantly recognizable, yet also alienating. Townsfolk sometimes viewed him as a bringer of death rather than a healer. Children were frightened by his presence, and some adults believed the doctor himself might be cursed or infected. Yet without him, who else could step in to help? One can imagine the internal conflict many plague doctors felt. They were often hired by the city or town, receiving meager pay, and sometimes required to purchase their own protective gear. Some entered the profession out of a sense of duty or religious calling. Others out of desperation, with few alternatives for survival. They were confronted daily with suffering, death, and the limits of their own knowledge. Some doctors succumbed to the disease themselves, disappearing quietly from records, their fates unknown. The methods they employed were a mixture of practical care, superstition, and the medical theories of the time. Bloodletting, for example, was believed to rebalance the body's humors, a concept dating back to Hippocrates. While often harmful, it was a standard treatment. Herbal remedies and poultices were applied to the bubo's painfully swollen lymph nodes that oozed blackish fluid, the disease's signature. The doctors also advised fumigation, burning incense or aromatic woods in the hope of cleansing the air. These treatments, while largely ineffective, offered patients and families some comfort and action in the face of powerlessness. In a way, the plague doctor's presence was as much psychological bomb as it was medical intervention. He was a visible sign that someone cared, that help was arriving, even if it often came too late. Let's pause to consider the social impact of the plague on the families themselves. When a family member fell ill, the household's dynamic shifted dramatically. Caregivers became exhausted, resources dwindled, and tensions rose. In many cases, survivors were left to bury loved ones themselves, often at night or in secret. To avoid further contagion, burial grounds overflowed, and mass graves became common. The sight of shallow pits filled with bodies must have been a haunting and constant reminder of mortality. Children orphaned by the plague were an especially tragic consequence. Many were taken in by relatives or church institutions, but countless others wandered streets, begging or stealing to survive. The social fabric was frayed, and communities struggled to provide even the most basic support. Some cities organized orphanages or charitable groups, but these efforts were often overwhelmed by the scale of need. Religious institutions played a complex role during plague outbreaks. On one hand, they provided comfort, care, and charity. Monks, nuns, and priests often tended the sick, risking their own lives. On the other hand, the church faced criticism for failing to prevent the disease or adequately explain its cause. Some clergy interpreted the plague as divine punishment, urging repentance and public acts of contrition. Processions and ceremonies were held to seek forgiveness, though these sometimes inadvertently facilitated the disease's spread. In the midst of this, we find stories of remarkable individuals, some famous, others anonymous, who shaped the narrative of the plague. Take, for instance, the case of Nostradamus, the French physician and astrologer who lived through the outbreaks of the 16th century. He wrote extensively on plague prevention, advocating hygiene, quarantine, and herbal remedies. showing a surprisingly modern understanding of contagion for his time. His writings blended science and mysticism, reflecting the era's blurry line between medicine and superstition. Similarly, in the Italian city-states, efforts to control the plague included early forms of isolation, hospitals called lazarettos, where infected patients were sent to be cared for apart from the healthy. These were some of the first attempts at systematic quarantine and infection control, though conditions inside were often grim. Still, the concept of separating the sick from the well was a crucial step forward. The plague's impact on culture and art is another gentle, fascinating layer to consider. The pervasive presence of death inspired a wave of artistic expression, focused on mortality and the fleeting nature of life. Paintings, sculptures, and literature from this period are filled with symbols like skulls, hourglasses, and skeletons, reminders of the ever-present shadow of death. The Danse Macabre, or Dance of Death, became a popular motif, illustrating that death comes for all, regardless of status or wealth. This somber reflection on death and decay can seem bleak, but it also opened a space for philosophical contemplation and eventually a renewed appreciation for life. The plague's devastating reach forced people to confront the fragility of existence, inspiring a certain quiet humility that resonates through art and writing for centuries afterward. In literature, the plague appears as both a literal and metaphorical force. Writers like Boccaccio, in his Decameron, chronicled tales told by survivors who fled the city to escape the disease, weaving stories of love, loss, and human folly. These works provide a snapshot of how people coped through storytelling, humor, and human connection in the darkest times. Science and medicine evolved, slowly but surely, in the plague's wake. The notion that disease might be caused by tiny, invisible creatures was centuries away, but observations made during plague outbreaks planted important seeds. Doctors noted patterns in transmission, the role of cleanliness, and the benefits of isolation. These early insights paved the way for later breakthroughs by scientists like Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch, of course. No discussion of the plague, Doctor, would be complete without revisiting the iconic masked, the beaked visage that has captured imaginations for centuries. This mask was designed not only to protect, but also to intimidate. Filled with aromatic herbs and spices, the beak was supposed to purify the air inhaled by the wearer. Its strange shape also made the plague doctor instantly recognizable, a walking symbol of both fear and aid. Today, the image of the beaked mask often appears in popular culture, from carnival costumes in Venice to video games and horror films, a haunting reminder of an era when death seemed to stalk the streets openly. As our thoughts drift further, we might reflect on the strange paradox that the plague brought, a massive loss of life that nevertheless spurred important social, medical, and cultural changes. Labor shortages gave surviving workers more bargaining power, slowly eroding feudal structures and paving the way for modern economies. The Church's diminished authority invited reform and new ways of thinking. Public health, once a vague concept, became a necessity that governments had to address. In the end, the plague doctor's diary, those sparse records of symptoms, treatments, and deaths, is a small but significant testament to human perseverance. Though they often failed to save lives, plague doctors bore witness, kept track, and tried their best. Their strange masks and solemn duties remind us of a time when humanity stood at the brink, fumbling toward understanding in a fog of fear. So, as you settle into the quiet of the night, imagine once more that lone figure, moving softly through the darkened streets, a beacon of both dread and hope. The plague doctor's tale is not one of grand victories, but of steady endurance, a whisper of courage in a world weighed down by sorrow. And as you drift toward sleep, may that quiet courage linger gently in your dreams. For tonight, we're drifting back to a world where the edges of continents gently touched, where the whisper of silk on skin and the clink of coins echoed through dusty. We're slipping along the winding routes of the Silk Road, that vast network of trade and travel stretching thousands of miles, linking east and west in a delicate dance of goods, gossip, and sometimes outright skullduggery. So dim the lights, settle in just right, and let's wander slowly through this ancient web of secrets now. The Silk Road wasn't a single road, not by any stretch. It was a sprawling, messy tangle of trails, rivers, and passes crossing deserts and mountains, linking empires that rarely quite trusted each other. Imagine, if you will, merchants burdened with precious cargo, bolts of silk shimmering with the soft light of distant looms, rare spices that tingled tongues and noses alike, dazzling gems that caught the sun's lazy afternoon rays. Yet beneath the surface of this shimmering trade was a world less glamorous, a world of spies, subtle rivalries, and plenty of royal paranoia. Our journey begins in China, where silk production was a jealously guarded secret for centuries. The Chinese emperors considered silk the fabric of the gods, a luxurious thread spun by the humble silkworm but transformed into a symbol of power and prestige. They naturally didn't want their competitors to get their hands on the secret, so for centuries, exporting raw silk was punishable by death. But as always, human curiosity and greed found a way. A couple of monks, because of course it was monks, managed to smuggle silkworm eggs hidden in their hollowed-out walking sticks, thus unraveling the monopoly and sowing the seeds of a flourishing international trade. As silk wove its way westward, it passed through a dizzying array of kingdoms and city-states, some thriving, some barely holding on. The merchants who braved these routes were a curious bunch, part entrepreneur, part diplomat, part adventurer, and part opportunist. They carried not only goods but news, ideas, and, as it turned out, secrets. Because whenever valuable things move through uncertain lands, there are always those interested in who's carrying what and why. That the Sogdians, an Iranian people living in what is now Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, were among the most skilled and well-connected traders of the Silk Road. Their cities, like Samarkand and Bukhara, were bustling centers where languages mingled. Religion spread, and deals were struck beneath ornate domes. The Sogdian merchants didn't just sell silk or spices, they dealt in information. In fact, you might think of them as some of the first international spies, using their vast network to keep tabs on rival empires and report back to their sponsors. Not far behind in this shadowy game were the Byzantines, whose capital, Constantinople, was a glittering jewel and a critical terminus for goods traveling west. Byzantine rulers, ever wary of Persian or later Arab rivals, employed spies and informants to monitor trade caravans and intercept diplomatic messages. The spice trade, in particular, was a source of endless tension. Spices weren't just for cooking. They were symbols of wealth and power, and controlling their flow could make or break an empire's fortune. Speaking of spices, imagine the journey of something as simple as peppercorn or cinnamon. It might start on an island in the Indian Ocean or in a far-off jungle and then be carried hundreds or thousands of miles over treacherous terrain, changing hands many times along the way. Each trader added a markup, each city added its own taxes and tolls, and by the time the spices reached European tables, their price had soared to levels that could buy entire armies. Naturally, the desire to control these routes sparked countless conflicts, covert operations, and diplomatic maneuvering. Then there were the camel caravans themselves, the slow-moving heartbeats of the Silk Road. Camels were called the ships of the desert, and for good reason. They could carry heavy loads over arid landscapes, survive with little water, and traverse terrain that would have spelled doom for horses or oxen. The caravans moved at a steady, unhurried pace, often only 20 to 30 kilometers a day, winding through deserts like the Taklamakan or the Gobi. The merchants and their animals faced harsh conditions, sandstorms, bandits, and the ever-present risk of exhaustion or death. Bandits, of course, were a constant concern. Some were simple highway robbers, preying on the vulnerable, while others were more organized, almost like proto-mafias, controlling entire stretches of the road. They demanded protection fees, or seized cargo outright, turning the Silk Road into a patchwork of zones with varying degrees of safety. This made caravans sometimes delay journeys or take longer, less direct routes, adding layers of complexity and risk. But beyond bandits, the Silk Road was also a conduit for cultural exchange, one that quietly shaped the world. Religions spread along these routes: Buddhism from India to China, Islam from Arabia into Central Asia, and Christianity into far-flung corners of the world. Art and technology moved alongside goods. You might find Persian ceramics in a Chinese palace or Chinese paper in a Persian library. Even the concept of zero, developed in India, traveled west and would eventually revolutionize mathematics in Europe. One particularly fascinating aspect is how rulers used the Silk Road to project power. The Mongol Empire, for example, under Genghis Khan and his descendants, managed to unify much of the Silk Road under one banner. This created an unprecedented period of relative peace and stability, sometimes called the Pax Mongolica. Caravans could travel with fewer risks, and the exchange of goods and ideas blossomed. Naturally, the Mongols also used their network for intelligence gathering and diplomatic missions, sending envoys to far-off lands. Despite the glamour, it's easy to overlook how precarious these vast networks were. Any war, drought, or political upheaval along the route could disrupt trade for years. The fall of key cities, shifts in empire boundaries, or the rise of new sea routes could all cause the Silk Road's pulse to falter. By the late 15th century, the arrival of European sea explorers looking for direct access to Asian goods began to siphon off the land-based trade, slowly dimming the Silk Road's centuries-old glow. Still, for all its danger and complexity, the Silk Road remains a testament to humanity's restless curiosity and desire for connection. It was not just a route for riches, but a highway for stories, ideas, and sometimes a little bit of mischief. So, as you drift toward sleep, picture a caravan silhouetted against a moonlit desert, camels moving slowly, merchants exchanging goods, and gossip, and the quiet, endless weaving of a world connected by a single, shimmering thread. As our caravan continues along the Silk Road, we find ourselves drifting deeper into the subtle, often overlooked details of this ancient exchange. The road was more than just a trade route, was a living, breathing organism, its veins pulsing with the lives of countless people, each contributing their own story to the vast tapestry. One of the most quietly intriguing aspects of the Silk Road was the variety of currencies used along the way. Unlike today, where most trade happens with standardized money or credit, the Silk Road featured an ever-shifting kaleidoscope of coins, bars, and sometimes even goods themselves acting as currency. Gold coins minted in one empire might be accepted halfway across the continent, but sometimes traders had to negotiate with barter, exchanging silk bolts for spices or horses for precious metals. This fluidity required a great deal of trust and negotiation skill. Naturally, this gave rise to professional money changers and brokers, who specialized in determining the relative value of currencies from far-flung lands, because you can't exactly pay for your camel's food with a handful of jade beads from China. Speaking of jade, it was one of the many treasures traveling the Silk Road that captivated elites in both East and West. Jade had a special place in Chinese culture, symbolizing purity and immortality. Its significance went beyond mere decoration. It was believed to have spiritual powers and was often used in burial rites and imperial regalia. The problem was, jade sources were rare and often located hundreds of miles away, necessitating long and sometimes perilous journeys. This scarcity added to its allure, and like silk, jade became a precious commodity traded along the Silk Road as our caravan moves further westward. We pass through the steppes of Central Asia, where the nomadic tribes played a curious role in the Silk Road's story. These tribes, including the Scythians, the Huns, and later the Turks and Mongols, were often seen as both protectors and threats to the caravans. At times, they provided much-needed security and guidance through vast, unmarked lands. Other times, they were the very bandits that threatened the flow of goods and ideas. Their fluid loyalties and shifting alliances meant that merchants always traveled with a keen eye on local politics, never quite sure who might be friend or foe at the next oasis. One particularly fascinating figure in this milieu was Tamerlane, or Timur, the Turco-Mongol conqueror from the 14th century. While his reputation tends to be overshadowed by his penchant for brutality, he was also a great patron of trade and culture. His empire sat right on the Silk Road, and he sought to restore the routes disrupted by years of war and decline. Cities, especially Samarkand, became glittering centers of architecture, scholarship, and commerce. The caravanserais, those roadside inns for travelers and merchants, flourished under his rule, offering rest, food, and sometimes entertainment to weary traders. Of course, Timur was also known for his grandiose self-image, commissioning towering statues and sprawling palaces that seemed to say, "Yes, I conquered the Silk Road, and yes, I want you to know it." As the caravans crossed into the Middle East, the story took on yet another layer. The Persian empires, particularly during the Safavid and earlier the Sassanid periods, saw the Silk Road as a vital artery of their economic and political power. Persian artisans produced exquisite textiles, ceramics, and metalwork that found eager buyers from China to Europe. Their capital cities became cultural melting pots, where poets, scientists, and diplomats mingled with merchants. Persian rulers also employed elaborate systems of intelligence, gathering to maintain control over their territories and protect trade interests. Couriers carried messages at lightning speed across the empire, and spies infiltrated rival factions. The importance of information was perhaps best captured in the legendary Great Game of later centuries, but its roots lay deep in the ancient practices of Silk Road empires. In a sense, every piece of silk or spice that traveled the road also carried a whisper, a rumor, a piece of gossip that could shift alliances or spark intrigue. Down in the Arabian Peninsula, the port cities of Oman, Yemen, and the Persian Gulf, acted as crucial maritime nodes linking the Silk Road's overland routes to the Indian Ocean trade network. Merchants here dealt not only in silk and spices, but also in incense, pearls, and frankincense goods that had been prized since antiquity. The Arabian traders were masters of navigating both sea and desert, and their dhow ships sailed with steady confidence, braving monsoons and pirate-infested waters alike. It's worth noting that these sea routes would eventually overshadow the Silk Road's land routes, but for centuries they complemented each other, knitting together a truly global trade network. Moving further west, the Mediterranean basin offers another fascinating chapter. The city of Constantinople, the Byzantine jewel, stood at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, controlling the final leg of the Silk Road's journey. Byzantine emperors were well aware of their strategic advantage and wielded it like a weapon. They could regulate what goods entered Europe, imposing taxes that fattened their coffers, but sometimes made silk or spices prohibitively expensive for ordinary folk. This control also gave them a degree of political leverage over their neighbors, as access to luxury goods was often a symbol of status and power. However, the Byzantine world was hardly a peaceful place. Constant threats from Persian, Arab, and later Ottoman forces meant that trade was a delicate balancing act, often disrupted by sieges or border skirmishes. Traders were sometimes forced to divert their caravans or risk losing everything to war. This precariousness shaped not only the economics of the Silk Road, but also its cultural legacy, encouraging the spread of ideas, technologies, and religions. As merchants sought alliances or new markets by the time goods reached Europe, they had undergone countless transformations, physical, economic, and cultural. The rich colors of silk dresses might have inspired local fashion. The spicy aromas brought new tastes to European kitchens. The intricate designs of Persian carpets influenced tapestry and embroidery. But alongside these tangible changes, the Silk Road also helped spark a sense of curiosity about distant lands. Tales of the East, filled with wonders and exotic peoples, trickled back to European courts and monasteries, planting seeds for future exploration. One such tale that captured the imagination was that of Marco Polo, the Venetian merchant who traveled extensively through Asia in the late 13th century. His accounts, though sometimes exaggerated, offered Europeans a rare glimpse into the mysterious lands of the Mongol Empire and beyond. Polo's journey highlighted the interconnectedness of the Silk Road world and underscored how information itself became one of the most valuable commodities. His stories of the Great Khan's court, the bustling markets of Kashgar, and the marvels of Cathay sparked imaginations and may have influenced later explorers like Columbus and Magellan. But behind these grand narratives were countless smaller, quieter lives. The caravan drivers, often overlooked, were the backbone of the trade. Their knowledge of the land, weather patterns, and safe passages was vital. They endured isolation, harsh climates, and the ever-present threat of bandits. Their families often followed the caravan routes, creating mobile communities that adapted to the rhythms of the Silk Road. Over generations, these people developed customs, languages, and traditions that blended elements from multiple cultures. Reminder that the Silk Road was not just a highway for goods, but also for people in this vast, complex system. It's also worth noting the role of women, who, though rarely highlighted in historical texts, played essential parts. In some caravanserais, women managed the inns and markets, providing meals and shelter to travelers. In Central Asia, noble women sometimes acted as patrons of trade and culture, their influence stretching across borders, and in the merchant families that moved along the routes, women maintained household economies, raised children, and preserved traditions, quietly weaving the social fabric that kept the trade alive. As we drift further along the Silk Road, it's impossible not to mention the occasional strange or unexpected incidents, those little quirks that make history so human. For example, there were instances of merchants bribing local officials with everything from fine silks to exotic perfumes just to secure passage or lower tariffs. Or consider the peculiar requests of some rulers who might demand entire caravans of rare animals, peacocks, monkeys, or even ostriches, gifts or tributes, turning trade missions into unofficial zoological expeditions. Sometimes, traders found themselves caught in diplomatic quarrels or local superstitions that made their journeys far more complicated than simply loading goods onto camels. One cannot help but admire the patience and resilience required to navigate such a labyrinthine world. The Silk Road was a place where the grand ambitions of emperors met the everyday struggles of merchants and travelers, a crossroads where cultures clashed and blended in slow, deliberate motion. It's a world that teaches us about the value of connection, the complexity of exchange, and the endless dance between trust and suspicion. As you settle deeper into the softness of your bed, imagine the desert winds sighing softly, the slow clatter of camel hooves on sand, and the flicker of lantern light in a distant caravanserai. Picture traders sharing quiet conversations under star-studded skies, exchanging not just goods, but stories and dreams. The Silk Road, in all its tangled, shimmering complexity, reminds us that history is not just a series of events, but a gentle unfolding, a story woven from countless threads, each adding its own quiet beauty. If you like, I can keep gently unfolding this story further, exploring more corners of the Silk Road, its personalities and its secrets. Just let me know. For now, rest easy and let the soft echo of ancient footsteps carry you toward sleep.